Let's see what the stew has for us today.
Welcome to the Gnomecast, Gnome Stew's tabletop gaming advice podcast. Here we talk with the other gnomes about gaming things to avoid becoming part of the stew, so I guess we better be good. Today we have myself, Jared, along with JT and Pete, and today we're going to ask each other questions. Inspired by RPGaDay, which was from back in August, we're going to each take a prompt from the list and ask our fellow gnomes to answer a question inspired by that prompt. Because this episode is all questions, we're going to skip the Get to Know a Gnome question and dive right in. Hey, JT, what did you pick out for us?
All right, so I picked meet was the word that I picked, and the question I came up with was, how did you meet the person you've role-played with the longest? So Jared, how about you? How did you meet your longest role-playing partner?
Oh my gosh, so I'm trying to think right now with my current group, probably the person that I've been playing with the longest has probably been a little over 10 years. And that has come about because we were playing at the same local game store, and I would run generally open tables, so I was, ending up with, people that were interested in playing, and I just managed to get a few people that kind of gravitated and were there from game to game. I guess I should take that as a compliment that I kept a lot of the people that I started originally playing with, but it really came from that idea of running open tables at a game store, and some of those people are still in my online regular group today.
Nice.
JT, was that the same for you?
Same for me. As far as like meeting people
At the game store.
at the game store. So I've got two answers to this. One is one of my longest friends like ever. We've known each other since like 92, 93, around there somewhere. We don't game much together anymore because of geographic differences. He's in one city, I'm in another. And I'm not a big fan of online playing. It doesn't capture the same feel for me. But the guy that I'm still gaming with today that I've gamed with the longest has been about 21 years. And we actually met at work. He had no idea I was a gamer. I had no idea he was a gamer. Him and his...
How long did that go on for?
Oh, gosh, probably about 3 months. And then it was him and his now ex-wife's anniversary, and they gave each other sets of metal dice. And because of a weird confluence of scheduling, they had to do it at the office instead of like over dinner or whatever. So I'm in Bill's office when Natalie walks in, and she's like, "Hey, here's your dice," and he's like, "Oh, hey, here's your dice." They kind of coordinated what they were getting each other. And I was like, whoa, hold on, you guys are gamers, and one thing led to another, and I've been gaming with Bill since like 1999.
Was that an instantaneous? Did you throw that out there immediately, like excited, or were you like, was there no pause? You were like, oh wait.
So
I don't know how deep
Bill was
they're
my
in.
team lead. Yeah. No, Bill was my team lead at work, and I was a junior engineer. He was a very senior engineer, so there was an intimidation level.
Yeah.
And he didn't try to intimidate me. It was just my perception of him because he's the senior guy, right? So it took me about 3 more months to finally get the courage up to go up, rubbing your toe in the dirt. And, hey, Bill, I know you're a gamer and so am I. Would you mind if maybe, I kind of stopped by and rolled some dice with you maybe? And so he laughs because he's actually a really easygoing guy. And I've learned that over the decades. But he laughed. He's like, yeah, sure, show up. We play Friday nights or Saturday nights or whatever it was at the time, and we've been great friends ever since.
You see, I asked because I thought maybe for a second here all of us were going to say we met our oldest people at game stores, right? So
sure.
Piggybacking on what Jared said was that the first person I think of, I always talk about because it was like a study hall class, and I didn't know what RPGs were, and I was looking through a book, and it was the Denver box set for Shadowrun, 2nd edition.
Mm-hmm.
And the person next to me, just slightly ahead of me, like could kind of look over their shoulder, and they had a Rifts book. And they started talking to me like I knew what I was talking about. I had no idea what I was reading. I just thought the pictures were cool, and it was such a unique thing, and I liked comic books. And somehow I ended up with a Shadowrun 2nd edition book, which was, way above my reading level and math levels. But really when I got started and when I met the people who I would still game with, even today, it was mostly at the game store, where I would also see this individual again. But, that's where I really met this core group of people that became lifelong friends. So, Jared, when you mentioned that, I was like, I wonder, like, how much more invested does that make? Is that why we're on Gnome Stew? Is like everybody had
Yeah.
a real community around them from young age? Yeah, because that game store experience is, like you said, you have this more openness because you run games at more of an open table with a revolving door of people come in and out. You have that sense of community around the gaming. You have more games around you immediately. You're
Yeah.
not just
Right.
solely the D&D guy. I mean, even if you are, you see a lot more because you're in an environment.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's also that energy, the back room or side room or whatever, the game area where you play the games at the game
I love you
store.
said the back room, side
Um,
room. That's such a thing,
Yeah, because the retail's up front.
Yeah.
That's how they make their buck, right? And you got to make your way through the shelves to get in the back room where you're gonna play your game, and just the energy that's back there. Where I play, like half the place is dedicated to Warhammer 40K because that's the bulk of the gaming at this particular store, and the other half is split between pick a random game, and whether it's role playing games, Magic the Gathering, board games, Pokemon, whatever, right? But even though we're all playing like different stuff, we have the same passion and energy for let's get together and have some fun in using these like little shiny rocks that make magic random numbers.
There was a really interesting community. I don't mean to get too far off track here, but there was a really interesting community at our local game store where once a month there was this big World of Darkness. It wasn't quite a LARP, but it was sort of. And people were basically running different tables of different aspects of World of Darkness, but they were all in the same campaign.
Oh, wow.
So like someone would go from like one table and mention like, we're sending a representative over to your people here, and they would set up that scene and then run between the two tables. So like the vampires would have like a meeting with the mages, and then there would be that interaction, and they kind of split back off again. And
That's
there was
cool.
like one person that was coordinating all the tables to make sure that there was still like a through line through all of them. So that was a really interesting dynamic that was going on there for a while at the game store.
That's impressive.
How old was the audience? Like the players?
Probably 20s, 30s.
Okay. I was curious. I think sometimes it's the internet that kind of squashed some of that too. Is that we just, people can do so much at home that like that faded a lot of that community where we would be a lot more comfortable spending more time. I think that's the real thing is the time commitment. It used to be, hey, it's not like I don't know. What I'm trying to say is like I can't imagine that groups of people would sit at tables with the obvious delay that there would be in each of their own personal games to have that sort of giant game going on simultaneously. And it seems like something lost. It's like a relic of that era of time because the internet just kind of squashed it in so many different facets with phones and social media and pictures and the ability to play online and finding players like your play style. And because I try to get people back in the game stores and it's difficult because people are just a lot flakier and they're not there as long or as often or as frequent and don't want to be there for, all day. Right. So.
Yeah, I think the most successful thing in the local game store right now has been the Adventurers League tables because there's that mix of there's enough people for continuity that always show up, and then your other 2 or 3 people at the table, it's fine if they swap in and out.
Yeah, and I know locally we're lucky in my community. I'm in Northwest Indiana. We have a lot of local game stores, so it's also nice that that's just a guaranteed thing. You can go into a local game store. And then if you have any troubles or you don't like the people at one store, you could really just go next Wednesday to the next local one. If you don't mind another 10 more minute commute or something.
So just so we don't panic anyone over the length of this episode, Pete, what was your word and what question did you come up with from that
there were
one?
so many good words. I don't know. And me just like I really wanted to talk about forest. It seemed like more specific and like kind of meta, which is the kind of, I get geek out on some of these. Obviously, I have a new Kickstarter coming out that deals with tower, when it comes to block tower. But ultimately, I settled on humor because I was really curious about what RPG brings out the laughs most for each of you and like groups you're used to. And like, what is it about those games? So, Jared, why don't you start on this one?
All right. Well, what's weird is my regular group, I have to say, is really good about kind of understanding the genre that we're playing. So like in our Star Trek game, there isn't like a lot of random humor. There's humor that is almost the type of thing that you would see in a Star Trek episode. But in general, probably the most ongoing humorous thing that we had recently was I was running the Tales of the Old Margrave anthology of adventures from Kobold Press. And those adventures are for 5e D&D, and it's very focused on kind of like dark Eastern European fairy tales. And my players decided to run with the idea that 3 of them were going to be playing bearfolk, and 1 of them was going to be a halfling warlock. So therefore we had
Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Yes, nice. Nice.
But what was really great about that is...
parade there. I was like, okay,
yes.
3 big, 1 small. You said Goldilocks is awesome.
But we thought there for a while, like this could have easily just been a complete joke campaign. But what ended up happening was there were these moments where like they were so earnest and they so wanted to help people because they were playing these characters that were like the good part of the fairy tale. And it actually, like there was a lot of humor that just, grew out of these bearfolk not understanding these silly humans that they were around. And the halfling was basically the one trying to explain to them, no, this is a human cultural thing, and
nice.
There was just like a lot of that, but it was great because it was contextual. It wasn't like it got completely out of hand and derailed the campaign. It was within the framework of the storyline. And cool. we did something similar, like we were playing Curse of Strahd at the game store, and all of us made characters that were based on Disney princesses. And it was really funny because at first it's like, oh, this is going to be really humorous. We're playing Disney princesses in Ravenloft. But what it turned into was how horrified these princesses were coming from these lands that were, idyllic and had like maybe one major problem that you had to solve, to traveling through Barovia where we couldn't fix anything and everything we did made things worse.
Nice.
It was great.
JT, what about you?
So there's probably some listeners out there screaming at their stereo or their headphones or their phone or whatever, going, "You haven't mentioned paranoia yet."
Yeah,
right? And I'm gonna highly disappoint them in that I'm not going to talk about paranoia because it's like pointing at the guy that is the funny one in the group and pointing at him and say, "Tell me a joke, be funny," and it just brain locks them, right? They can't do it. So every paranoia game I've run, we sit down, and it's wacky, it's zany, it's gonzo, but it's not humorous because the point is to be humorous, but because you're trying to force the humor, it's not funny.
Mm-hmm.
I've played in one paranoia game where the game master was just phenomenal, and maybe it's a game, maybe I'm just horrible at running paranoia, I don't know. But that was funny, and that was fun. But when I've run paranoia, it's like, it's uncomfortable. Because everybody's trying to be funny,
blame
but
the computer.
failing to be funny. It just doesn't work. So I'm going to go with riffs, actually, since you mentioned riffs earlier, Pete. Because that is such insane weirdness. If you get enough of the splat books together,
the mashups, right?
The mashups. You are going to get some weird, crazy ass stuff. I played a intelligent velociraptor that had the big frill thing, and he could hiss, and between the frill and the hiss, it inspired fear in people. But I decided, in anybody that witnessed the display, but I decided that he would only do that when something scared him. So about every third combat ended up with something ambushing us, me frilling at it, and me running away because I'm scared, and it running away because it's scared of me, and the rest of the party just standing there going, "What the just happened?" And so, and I've got many other hilarious riffs stories, and I don't know what it is about
portals.
Riffs, but it brings out the
just portals. Yeah, just drop in whatever they want.
It brings out the weirdness. So riffs for me is a humor game, but it's baked in. It's not like a meta layer of humor sitting on top of the game. It's actually part of the game.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's one of the reasons why I ultimately picked humor, was because it's really interesting when you think about it, like where it comes from. Like, can it come from the game? And I'm really happy that, like JT, like you mentioned that, because it is a funny thing that a funny thing. Oops, sorry. It's really difficult to put people on the spot to be like, all right, I need you to be funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's interesting that a lot of times, right? Like Jared, you mostly mentioned playing D&D, right? Like we wouldn't think of D&D as a humor game first, right? Action adventure, but sometimes, right? It's the meta, it's the out of game talk, it's the chemistry of the players. But it's neat to hear, right? Like the coincidence of the characters that you made and put them together. It's the party makeup that was funny, or the randomness of a very serious game that mashes things up.
Yeah.
I know in my case, I was thinking one of my favorite games is Monsters and Other Childish Things by Art Dream. And in some ways, it's designed to be funny because I usually say it's kind of like South Park meets Cthulhu. Because you're kind of like a bunch of kids that have monster friends. And the monsters are alien, super dark. And by alien, I mean they don't understand people.
Yeah.
And a kid is so restricted by, these imaginary like lines, right? Like it's like you have curfew. You've got to do things because mom will be mad at you. As an adult, these things matter, but not to the degree of like, you try to explain to Cthulhu why, like you have to get an A in your math test, and Cthulhu does not understand. Right? So how Cthulhu will help you will be like driving your math teacher insane, and thinking, well, then now there's no problem. So it's funny because in that case, the game is funny because the character dynamic, right, of the one playing kids in a situation with these ultimate powerful beings who can't help but mess things up because they don't understand.
Nice.
Yeah.
But it's the naturally zany concept. So I guess it's kind of the mashup again. It's that combination because it doesn't ask the players to be funny themselves. It just makes them be characters of a certain type that naturally are put into a funny situation, right? So.
Cool. So we got one question left, I believe, and that's yours, Jared. What do you got for us?
Mine seems so much less interesting than your two.
It does now, but it won't be by the time you're done.
So I picked rest because what's interesting to me is trying to figure out how to make rest, or even the time between the on-screen moments in the game, how does that advance the story of the game? Like sometimes even just what does time mean when you're not on screen and actually playing the scenes actively?
So when I was listening to what you're saying, but I was thinking about how I was going to frame it. So do you think it's different? Does it matter? Do you want us to talk more about like the off screen, or do you want us to talk about how we put it on screen?
I think just how those scenes that involve characters at rest would advance the story.
Yeah. So JT, if you don't mind, I want to jump on that one first.
Go for it. Run with it.
I think sometimes with pacing, it's so critical that we're players playing a game, and obviously we want that climax, we want the tension, we want to pursue the storyline to a narrative conclusion. But just like real life, if it doesn't rain sometimes and you don't have bad days, it's hard to appreciate the good days. So rest and travel sometimes are that necessary. I don't want to say evil, but they're you need to have those moments of like after the amazing conflict, or when we have all of this tension building and we know tomorrow the war begins, to kind of give the players a chance to take a breath. And I think like, I imagine this is like that campfire scene in the forest, and this is when we can definitely use character moments of like spotlighting a person to either talk flashback, dreams, let them let out their feelings, right? Of like what's going on, what does it mean to them? But sometimes I feel like this almost has to be forced a little bit. Like you almost have to pick one person and push it. Like Savage Worlds kind of does that, where they're like, they almost say one person has a moment, draw a card. Because if you just naturally hey, there's a campfire over there, and let them just walk around aimlessly, they kind of won't use the moment, right?
Yeah.
That's from my experience, at least,
Yeah.
You end up with a session that was 2 hours at the campsite when you're like, it should have been 20 minutes.
What about you, JT?
So Pete mentioned the Savage Worlds Interlude system there, where everybody basically draws a card, right? Essentially rolling for initiative, because that's their initiative method, right? And whoever has the high card, tells a story about their character. When I'm running Savage Worlds, I also draw a card as the game master. And if I, quote unquote, win initiative, if I'm the one giving the interlude, I usually use that as a chance to foreshadow something. And I'll use that. I kind of tie I'll say, oh yeah, hey player, you remember your dad telling you about this clearing when he was traveling as a courier or a merchant or whatever,
Mhm.
and he stopped to rest here for the night and he encountered such and such thing. Well, if the party hasn't encountered whatever that thing is yet, I'm giving them a little foreshadowing, a little chance to know that maybe this is Baba Yaga's clearing and they don't know it. And
Mhm.
one of the players' fathers encountered Baba Yaga, somehow escaped, and it sets that up. It also sets up some tension and some mood in that it. Gosh, I'm losing my words already. So it sets up some tension in that you can set expectations with the party and I don't know, kind of prepare them for maybe what's coming, or maybe that thing doesn't happen at all. And you kind of give them a little head fake, or maybe you set them up for one thing and you give them a different thing.
I think that's really powerful, honestly. I
Yeah.
wish I would have said that now. That right, it's it was the moment where you could pace them, right? Because
Yeah.
players don't always, and the GM don't always have clear expectations of where we're going. Sometimes it's almost like you can use that as a moment to be like, "Hey, players, I'm the GM. I'm giving you a moment where we can talk about where we're going." And
Right.
sneakily, you've had like a little session 0 there, right?
Yeah, just a little
just
bit.
like a little bit of like where we're going, and everyone's like,
Mhm.
"Oh yeah, the
Right.
princess," you know. Or,
Yeah. One of the things that made me think of this is there's actually a mechanic in the Midgard setting from Kobold Press that says whenever you're between adventures, twice the amount of time passes as was your real time between sessions. So if you
Oh,
take
okay.
2 weeks, it's been like a month between adventures. And I kind of like that because there isn't that constant drive to where your adventurers went from like first to 15th level in 2 months
Yeah.
time because they're just constantly driving forward on things. But the other thing that I like about that is with 5th edition, there are a lot of downtime rules so that you can actually ask somebody, okay, what did you spend basically these days that you had off? And that really helped shape the narrative. And the other thing that that did for my Margrave campaign with the bears and the halfling is they ended up staying in one particular town. So that narrative created a lot more connection to that town because they were assuming, hey, we have this much time, we're spending it in this town. So part of that is, building houses here, starting businesses, becoming, friends with the people that are here locally, dropping off NPCs that we picked up as friends and integrating them into the community. And it really kind of built that town out as a really unique thing that they were connected to.
Nice.
And I
like
really
it.
like that.
Yeah, building those NPC connections, especially during downtime, because like an NPC connection during the spotlight time, the gameplay, that is almost like what can the NPC provide me, or what am I giving the NPC? There's a transactional thing, but if you do it during downtime, it's a emotional story building time, because the players and the game masters will have different expectations on what's going to happen during action scenes versus what's going to happen during downtime. I've seen a very clear shift in my group when I'm like, okay, you guys return back to Troll Skull Manor, talking 5th edition here, and the adventure, not the adventure's over, but you have accomplished, today's goals. What are you going to do? And everybody's like, I'm going to take 3 days off, or a 10-day off, because I want to, I just want to sit and do nothing, because they had the luxury of doing so.
Yeah.
And this was a very much player timing driven campaign. So I wasn't putting pressure on them to go. Now, if they were like, oh, we're going to take 6 months off, well, 2 weeks later, something's going to happen.
Yeah.
But I could see a shift in the attitudes of my players when it was downtime versus when it was action time. So
What was the shift?
more emotional, actually. They were more, actually, to be honest, they were more deeply involved in the story that we were jointly telling during downtime. During action, they were like, "Where's my mini? I'm rolling some dice. Can I get flank? So on and so forth." So it's definitely a deep shift. Combat is not storytelling time for my group. It happens on. I'll slip some storytelling in on occasion, but I do it rarely because I know the game style of my group. So yeah, the what you would consider the boring parts of a novel are actually the good parts of the novel for my group. So.
Yeah, and that's God. Just as far as like combat and role playing, I love having. I get disappointed if a boss monster type thing is not something that can give a monologue, because I love to talk to players and like
Yes.
drop hints and stuff like that while I'm clubbing them with giant claws and tentacles.
Yep.
That's actually one thing that it's a little bit wider than just rest, but I wish more games were genre savvy when it comes to how they express time, because a lot of games, especially more traditional games, always default to saying this takes this many hours, this takes this many days. And for example, not to overly pick on it, but like when I'm running a Star Wars game, there is no Star Wars story where it has ever mattered that it took 3 days to get from one side of the galaxy to the other. The speed of your hyperdrive is whether you can get there before the Imperials do.
Yeah.
And yet so much stuff defaults back to, you know, it takes you 3 days to build this droid. And I really wish things were, I don't know, framed more like, you know, this is an episode, and between episodes you can do this thing, and between 2 episodes you can do this thing, you know. I wish that were more the way people would structure time and downtime and rest and things like that. Like even in my Star Trek game that I run, when you give like long-term progress on things, you will determine what the interval is. And in an episode, it's fine to say this is going to take you a day, this is going to take you, you know, 2 days to work on an interval. But I've started, like, if somebody's doing like a really long-term project, like something you wouldn't see until halfway through the season, I've started making those intervals, this is an episode.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like you can make 1 check per episode to advance this long-term thing. I'm not going to tell you how long that is. It's just episodes. That's what we're going by right now.
Yeah, I think that's a really good
Cool.
idea.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I like the abstraction a lot better than the precision.
Mm-hmm.
It just makes for, well, like you said, better representative of genre style storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So
I wonder if it's like the, you know, sort of like simulation nature of like the tradition of the tradition of trad games, right? Like
Yeah.
right.
when we think of trad games, it's like we think of these games that have pulled back from the 80s, usually in the 90s, like long running series. So it's funny that that's back when we wanted all the physics, right? Like we wanted all of the numbers and data. Like
Yes.
I'm sure there's the argument to be made that it's the, you know, everyone understands time, right?
Yeah.
If your GM doesn't, you know, I don't know, doesn't want to talk abstract, right? Like they can figure it out, I guess.
That's actually been a thing that kind of almost like hits me like a roadblock when I do some of my reviews, when a game feels very like more story focused and more abstract, and then out of the blue there is a mechanic that deals with
4 hours.
literal time, and it's
Right.
like, how do I get back into this mode of actually measuring minutes and hours when everything else in this game has so far just been this, you know, overarching, it takes however long it takes. You know, it's very odd. It's an odd
It's
shift
like
there
they
sometimes.
super bolded it for you. They were like, this takes 43
Right.
minutes. You're like,
Yeah.
why does this take 43 minutes?
As a game designer, I'm struggling with that right now. So actually, my buddy Bill that I mentioned earlier, that I've known for 20-something years, he and I and another friend are creating a role-playing game. And our rule of thumb is if it can happen during combat, like picking a lock, for example, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then there's a precise measurement of time that's allocated for that activity.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something that can't be done during combat, say building a suit of armor or repairing something or whatever, then that's going to be abstracted. And, and we've called that out in the text of the game of here's the abstracted parts of the game, and here's the simulation parts of the game. So hopefully that if we ever get it out there in the world and you get a chance to read it, Jared, I hope that doesn't blow your mind that we have abstracted and precise measurements of time.
Well,
But
I mean,
we
it's
had
also
we had very
context.
clear, exactly, and we had very clear decisions going in on this.
Didn't Jared have an article today? Yeah, nobody's heard from him. He got a copy of JT's new game and just
Right?
Why did
fell
they
off
go
the
from
earth.
abstract to absolute? Oh, goodness. Well, and I even got to the point to where, like, for example, in Star Wars, when people would be like, oh, yeah, there's a timer on this bomb, it's going to go off. How much time is left on it? 3 rounds.
Yeah.
What does
Yep.
that translate into? Whatever you want it to translate into, it's 3 rounds because
That's
we're
3
doing
rounds.
this in.
Yep. You can do 3 things before boom. I like that.
Yeah. So I think in the interest of keeping this an actual short form podcast, which, we know there's an art to that. I think we'll go ahead and wrap this up. So, this show is funded by the Gnome Stew Patreon. You too can become a Patreon backer by following the Patreon link on the Gnome Stew website to the Gnome Stew Patreon. This ad is brought to you by the Kolu Institute of Random Questions. Remember, if your culture provides enough significant trivia, Girl Docs will not need to miniaturize one of your cities for long-term study and mark the rest of the planet for deletion. If you're enjoying the Gnomecast, you'll probably like many of the other Misdirected Mark shows. Here's one to check out.
She's a Super Geek. She's a Super Geek is an actual play RPG podcast highlighting women as GMs. Join them every other Tuesday for lots of different RPGs and guests.
You can find all of us at gnomestew.com, at Gnomestew on Twitter, and Gnomestew on Facebook. Gnomes, where else can we find you on the internet? Pete.
So you could find me at Vembranor, VEMBRANOR on Twitter. And as mentioned, my new Kickstarter is probably out for Deadbeat Dark Comedy Role-Playing with Rest in Pieces. So check that out.
And JT, where can we find you?
One-stop shop for all things me is going to be jtevans.net. And if you hit the top edge of every page on my website, you'll find links to all my social media, my own Patreon, my Royal Road for free fiction, so on and so forth. So
Awesome.
just jtevans.net. And how about you, Jared? Where can we find you online?
All right. Other than Gnome Stew, you can find me at whatdoiknowjr.com, which is my blog where I do a whole bunch of other reviews when I'm not doing reviews on the stew. And at whatdoiknowjr on Twitter. So, I have no official capacity in this one way or the other, but do you think we avoided the stew this week?
I'm pretty sure
I hope
we
so.
Because I'm pretty sure we went over.
Yeah, we did go over, not by much, but a little.
That's true.
What you don't know is our taskmaster told us 10 minutes per question, and I'm pretty sure it was like 33. So that's some extra whippings for us.
See, I would argue we could probably subtract out the time where we got completely off track and it wasn't about the question.
Oh, great.
Oh, yeah. There you go.
Editing.
On that note, thanks, everybody.
Gnomecast is hosted by Misdirected Mark Productions, the media arm of Encoded Designs.
Oh, God. That was terrible. Hey, Rob, cut this part out. I'm going to start over.